Chapter 45, Impressionism to Cubism. I dream of painting and then I paint my dream. Vincent van Gogh. This quote was presented at the beginning of the chapter and kind of depicts what the chapter is about. It's about a movement in changing the way that people look at art and the way that art is done. This chapter explores the dates of 1863 to 1937 through the transformation of realistic art from the Romantic era to Impressionism, to Post-Impressionism, to Cubism. Sculptures, music, and literature are also explored within the text, yet the main focus of this chapter is on canvas art. Much of this took place in Europe, particularly centered in France. There are many creative people and artists that are depicted throughout the chapter. Although I couldn't keep just 5, I have about 7 different artists that I'm going to explore. The first is Monet. He's known as the leader of Impressionist movement, and his focus and the focus of much of Impressionism was on light and color rather than the traditional emphasis on realism and shape. Much of Monet's focus was the study of color. The next is Manet. He was known as a romantic protest painter during the time. The painting that's shown here was a picnic in a park. It included a nude female with 2 males and another woman in the background. It wasn't the nude figure that caused controversy, but the casual nature of the woman in the picture. It created an impression that she might be a woman of ill repute. It mixed traditional expectations with shocking surprises, and kind of depicted what was going on within the society of the time. His desire was to concentrate on the technique and not the subject of his art. And by doing this, his paintings became less of a window to the world and more of a, quote, screen to which the world is depicted. He believed that it was the process and not the product that was the art. He was typically known as the bridge between traditional Romantic paintings and New Impressionism. The next is Renoir. His style and techniques shared Monet's concept of using patches of color placed side by side to let the eye blend them. Renoir typically painted people, and instead of focusing on some of the darker things of previous artists, he focused on the joy of life and the interplay of light and shadows on people. The next is Seurat. He lived somewhat after the Impressionists, but admired their focus on technique, and he wanted to use some of their concepts. He took their ideas of not blending colors to a new level, and he actually invented the painting style we know as pointillism. He used thousands of tiny dots to paint bigger pictures, as you can see in one of his most famous paintings. The next is Cézanne. Cézanne actually studied with the artist that I previously talked about, Manet. He learned principles and techniques of Impressionism, and he worked with that type of style briefly, but he soon expanded the ideals of Impressionism into his own style. Cézanne believed that all forms in nature are based on the cone, sphere, cylinder, and the cylinder, and he tried to suggest their presence wherever he painted and whatever he painted. He wanted to give more solidness to the Impressionist movement. He's known to begin the concept of abstract painting, and he actually falls in the post-Impressionism era. Cézanne is also known as the father of modern painting. Next we have one of the most famous painters of the time, Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh believed that Impressionism was too rigid and did not give the artist enough emotional freedom. So he fell also in the post-Impressionist era, and his styles were known as Expressionism. Van Gogh's paintings were alive with color and featured strong and obvious brushstrokes that often had swirling patterns, as you see in one of his most famous paintings, Starry Night. Next we have Pablo Picasso. He is known as the father of Cubism. This type of painting was inspired by Cézanne's effort to reduce figures to basic forms. You see in many of Pablo Picasso's paintings these abstract thinking and deconstruction of the subjects that he paints. And lastly, we have Rodin. His works were classical in concept but impressionistic in execution. One of his most famous sculptures is depicted here, known as the Thinker. He achieved a remarkable lifelike appearance with impressions of reality within his sculptures. If I were to develop a short slogan that captures this time period or culture's perspective on creativity, I chose, in order to creatively grow, one must rethink the conventional. In other words, we see that through this artistic movement, there's a progression. And because of that progression, artists are taking old thinking styles and being able to apply new concepts to them. It started with the technology of the paint and then progressed to different types of styles, from realism to impressions to cubism to abstracts. We see that in order to creatively grow, you have to rethink what's been done before. In other words, what's conventional or what's a conform piece of artwork from the society. There were two brief barriers that were discussed within the text of this chapter. One is the art critics of Impressionists. Like anything, when things change within a society, you're going to have critics. Eventually, these art critics actually began to like the impressionistic style of art of the time. The next is the appreciation of art from individuals outside of the domain. I really enjoyed this story of Picasso. And as he painted something outside, a guy came up to him and was seeing what he was working on and asked how much it was. Picasso answered the tourist with an outrageous price, and the tourist replied that he thought that his 6-year-old daughter could paint something that was just as good. Picasso's response made me laugh out loud, actually. He said, "Congratulations, sir, your daughter is a genius." So we see that both of these barriers within this chapter came from individuals that had a differing viewpoint on the art of the time as it was changing from previous types of art. There are 3 lessons that I drew from this chapter in terms of creativity that helped us also enhance our creativity. The first is craft and inspiration enable creativity, and that an artist needs both sides of the brain. Craft is developed through practice, which impresses patterns on the brain and is controlled principally by the left side. Inspiration, however, is on the right side and functions differently because it's actually stored information. We see that we need both, and in order to apply both to our pieces of art or our works of creativity, we need to be able to use both sides of the brain. The next is new concepts in art are directly related to concepts in technology. We see this at the beginning of the chapter when our technology of paint enhances. So technology had just given these artists a new tool. Oil paints began to be produced in little tubes. Previously, each painter would have to mix their own pigments with the oil to make their own paints. It would dry up, and they would waste, and they would have to waste more time mixing the paints. As technology increased, more efficiency in the world of art increased. We see this during this time period. And lastly, progressive movements in art occur through mentorship, previous perspectives, and personal inspiration. We see that there's change made throughout this era with this notion that you take previous ideas and kind of make them your own through inspiration, through the culture, through differing perspectives on art. By being able to look at previous successful artists, like those of Monet and Renoir and Matisse, we see that other artists are able to use the techniques and their strokes and the ways that they created art and then apply it to new ways and new forms to depict art within their realm of reality. Thanks for your time, guys. I really enjoyed this chapter. And I also suggest that if anybody's interested in these types of art, that they visit the Rodin Museum, which is located in Philadelphia, and the Barnes Museum, which is one of the most beautiful museums I've ever seen architecturally, but also the amount of artwork, the amount of Renoirs, the amount of Matisses, Monets that are in there is unbelievable. Again, I've enjoyed this term, and good luck on your finals, everyone.